going to be talking to you about supporting effective instruction and interventions within response to intervention and multi-tiered systems of support. And overall, I have kind of 5 major purposes to share with you today. First, I'd like to kind of help you envision what I imagine your role might be in MTSS and RTI. I'm going to start by contrasting, kind of piggybacking a little bit on what Tracy was talking about, some things that don't work in schools and what we might be able to improve on. I'm going to then highlight not only my own research or our team's research, but research by others. And this is involving some reviews of literature that I've conducted recently with some doctoral students. I'll summarize some promising new studies in a chapter that we've been working on, a review of larger reviews and meta-analyses. I'm going to focus on a particular study we conducted a while ago, and I'll describe also some examples of what might work that incorporates reading interventions and social and emotional learning components. And then I'm going to provide a brief overview of an intervention that we're designing that's an early intervention that incorporates both reading and some social and emotional learning components. And then I'll share some resources with you. Oops, let's see, there we go. So that's our purpose today. And so thinking about your role, I guess first and foremost, I think the most important thing for anyone that's working with children and families and working in schools right now is to think about being kind and compassionate to yourself. So what I'll be sharing today is not going to be perfect. It's what I know in my lived experience and my researched experience and the experiences that I've had as a teacher and a researcher. So I imagine that you might be engaging in ongoing learning as well about instruction, interventions, and the use of data. I'm imagining you're learning more ways to connect with families, with other professionals, and to advocate. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to share the research with your colleagues and school teams, and in turn, keep working with us so that us researchers are staying very current with what works within your own schools. So this role is important. Tracy mentioned a little bit about the challenging statistics that we are experiencing in the United States and the fact that so few children are reading at a proficient level, and that the rates of proficiency are lower for vulnerable children. I also wanted to point out that a majority of 4th grade students who have been identified with disabilities read even below the basic level on the NAEP tests. And so Freddie Hebert, I think, has presented for you guys before. She's written an interesting article making the point that when children do perform below a basic level at 4th grade, what that means practically is that they may be able to recognize some high frequency single syllable words, but they're really going to have a lot of challenges reading and engaging with unfamiliar multisyllabic words. So I just want us to keep that in the back of our minds. And I think Tracy did a great job of sharing the really frustrating consequences that can happen for children who don't finish school as good readers. As I said, I'm going to share a little bit about response to intervention and multi-tiered systems of supports. So most of you are probably familiar with this sort of pyramid model, although some of us may be working in schools where we feel like the pyramid's a little bit upside down. Basically, within most of these models, the implementation is intended so that most students would be well served by a strong core reading program. So this program should be explicit and systematic, following principles of structured literacy. and include a little bit of differentiation in small groups. So increasingly, we're seeing some intentional bleeding or collaboration and alignment with classroom teachers providing not just the universal interventions, but also providing some of the small group tailored interventions. In other schools, there may be resources for individuals to provide these secondary interventions. But Tier 3 is meant to be for very small groups of children. It's meant to be more assessment guided based on individual students' needs, more time, more frequent help, and it may or may not include special education. On the other side of the line, you'll note that just as interventions are increasing, it's really important to continue brief assessments to ensure that kids are mastering what they're being taught, so progress monitoring. When needed, some brief diagnostic tests that can also inform the next level of interventions. And so there are some differences, however, between response to intervention and multi-tiered systems of support. I'm going to start with the common elements. Common elements are, again, the systematic and explicit core, using universal screening. It can be very brief to spot students who are struggling. Interventions that target student needs that increase in intensity, and then more frequent progress monitoring. Multi-tier systems of support generally include a broader array of supports. They may include positive behavior supports, math, other academic supports, and generally the Every Student Succeed Act defines multi-tier systems of support as a continuum of evidence-based and systematic practices to support a rapid response, not a wait to fail, to students' needs, and with regular observation to facilitate data-based instructional decision-making. So I want to take a quick minute to kind of orient us, because I'm going to be talking a lot about effects and effect sizes today. So evidence-based or evidence-informed practices come from experimental studies where researchers might work with schools to assign either classrooms to one condition or another, teachers to one condition and maybe some of their students to another condition, or we might even randomly assign children that are matched on similar skills within a classroom to one condition or another. Sometimes there's just a control group or business as usual, a typical instruction, and just one treatment, but oftentimes we'll see that there'll be a couple of treatments. And so the range of scores that children perform within at the beginning and the end of an intervention might be thought of as being on a distribution. So when we say that there's an effect of one would mean that the average of these two distributions are such that there'd be a whole standard deviation of performance favoring those students that were in the treatment condition. That's a very large effect. And I just wanted to point out that practical and meaningful effects might be more like a fifth of a standard deviation or an effect size of about 0.2. I also want to be sure that I make the caveat today that if we talk about something as not yet having evidence, it may just mean that it hasn't been tested. Another kind of a framework that I want us to consider today is this notion, as Tracy was talking about, that when children have struggles with learning to read, it can be due to accumulating of effects across several reasons. They may have phonological impairments. These may run in the family. They may have broader language or attentional issues. They might also have experienced trauma. So these risk factors may somewhat be mitigated by resilience factors. And some of these factors in resilience, like good explicit instruction or effective parenting, can be broadly effective for all children, but they may be particularly protective for some students who carry a weightier set of risks. And so multi-tiered systems of support incorporate these social and emotional learning and positive behavior supports. The Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning defines SEL as the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply knowledge, attitudes, skills necessary to manage their emotions, to establish relationships, and make responsible decisions. So these are key aspects that support learning. And within the broader public health, as well as the reading and psychological fields, some interventions that are related to these constructs might be known as a growth, or having an open mind about being able to learn as opposed to a fixed mindset. Attribution theory, or attributing your success or failure not to luck or being liked, but to your own internal work. Motivation and self-efficacy. And again, these are some of the doctoral students, Dana Russell-Freudenthal and Mai Zaru, that are working with me in reviewing some of the literature to learn on the shoulders of some others. So I'm going to ask you, as we're moving through the presentation, to be sure to jot down any questions. I'll try to stop after each section and just remind you to think about some questions that you might have so far. And I'm going to be moving into the second section of the presentation now, where I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the school system supports that haven't always worked, in order to foreshadow what can be possible. So this is a model that was created by Domitrovich and colleagues. Some of you might be familiar with the theoretical framework also through Bronfenbrenner that talks about how people learn or how interventions are implemented as happening at sort of an individual level, but there's also school level and sort of macro systems or policy levels that influence the success of an intervention or even the implementation of an intervention or an approach such as multi-tier systems of support. So you might have heard of a large study that the federal government paid for to evaluate response to intervention in 2015, conducted by Bailu et al. And that study's been widely cited, and it used a different type of experimental approach where they examined children who were not performing at benchmark. And those children received an intervention, and the children who were just at benchmark, just the other side of that cut point, did not receive intervention. And in that study, they reported that children who didn't receive the intervention actually outperformed some of the kids in Tier 2. I want to point out that this was an evaluation of typical practice. This was not a program that was supported. So in other words, schools were not provided any extra support. They were just implementing RTI or MTSS on their own. And across the studies that were involved, there wasn't any consistent support for implementation. And so they also didn't use consistent screeners or progress monitoring measures. And maybe more importantly, in the context of what Tracy was talking about earlier, there was no consistent professional development, coaching, no monitoring of whether interventions were being received by children that were meeting the criteria for adherence or fidelity to those interventions, or even whether they received them for a full amount of time that was intended. We've also been conducting some work here at Southern Methodist University that was funded by the Institute for Education Science in a few different states and different districts. And we've been trying to learn more about what works within schools. So the participating schools, just like in the Baylor study, were doing their own thing, right? They were implementing the best that they could at the time. And we interviewed the RTI administrators, and these are just very preliminary results. But in some ways, they're kind of consistent with the pattern of findings. We haven't yet evaluated whether these interview results are directly associated, they can't be causal, with student reading outcomes. But generally speaking, the administrators were letting us know that mainly only screening tools were being used to identify students for intervention, of course, in addition to teacher nomination, but that progress monitoring wasn't very consistent, and it wasn't always the driver for decisions. And principals noted that they really needed help and support in how might they monitor behavior and behavior management as well as academics, and they expressed some concern about social and emotional learning. And this was before COVID, so this is all even prior to COVID. They also explained that those database decision-making processes that were so important as the definition of MTSS under the Every Student Succeeds Act seemed to be missing. So a performance below a cut point didn't necessarily mean that a student would receive intervention supports. We also found out that there were relatively informal discussions across and within grade levels about what to do to plan instruction for students, and that schools still did not have a consistent plan for ongoing professional development and coaching. They really were struggling with their resource needs, and particularly in schools where more than 5% of children needed Tier 3. So again, at this sort of, at beyond that school level, there's this other macro level that includes policies, financing, and sort of community partnerships. And I wanted to point out that over the past 10 years, and I think Tim hinted at this a little bit, and certainly Tracy, you discussed it, RTI and MTSS are both support systems, and ideally they're meant to be overlapping, not competing for resources or demands, or siloed into, this is an MTSS approach. This is something that we're doing to check the box for dyslexia legislation, or this is a program that's working only for ELLs. Ideally, this information is shared, but there is some confusion among schools in order to manage these resources that are in part because of this sort of outer macro level systems questions. So I'm going to next move into a section of our talk where I'm going to be describing a big picture review of other people's work. I'll be describing some findings, as I mentioned, from a chapter on early intervention, a chapter that we're still working on about effective word reading interventions, particularly with an eye to what might work within MTSS. So please keep track of your questions, start sharing them in the chat. And you might also begin to start thinking about school systems and supports that you might ask for or you might be a part of. So I'll talk a little bit now, as I mentioned, about this sort of large review of reviews. This is a paper that's out online. It's coming out in Reading Research Quarterly. And we kind of humbly called it What We Know and Need to Know About Literacy Interventions. And in particular, in this study, we did focus more on the elementary grades, but some of the studies also included older students. So I'm again going to kind of contextualize this within the idea of those effect sizes. And so we mentioned that, or I mentioned that practical and meaningful effects were those that are beyond a 0.20. So when we examined 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different meta-analyses and syntheses that had been conducted by others during this time frame after the National Reading Panel report came out, and during this context of a lot of political change around RTI, MTSS, and dyslexia, we were very encouraged to see that early literacy interventions were causally effective. We were only looking at studies that included an experimental control. The effects of these explicit and systematic interventions on code focus skills, so those that help on the side of the simple view of reading that relate to decoding, to phonemic awareness, as opposed to the meaning side or vocabulary and listening and language comprehension, reading comprehension. The effect sizes were stronger for these interventions for the younger students on the code focus side than they were on the meaning focus side. So we still need to know a little bit more about how to move the needle on fluency and comprehension. When we moved into looking at meta-analyses that focused on kids in upper elementary, or in some cases went up through high school, we found that, again, explicit and systematic interventions that focused on a combination of foundation or comprehension, or were both, were mostly implemented in small groups. The effect sizes are a little bit smaller on the code focused measures, and they get a little bit, they range to a little bit stronger on the comprehension side. We also were interested in writing to read, and so we examined meta-analyses that looked at instruction, not just intervention. There haven't been any meta-analyses that we were able to find that were just about writing interventions for students that were struggling readers. But we did find that there were overall positive effects for transcription and sentence level writing on fluency and on word reading. And again, these are relatively good effects, even though that we were even though the interventions were focused on writing. And explicit spelling instruction, perhaps not surprising to the audience, also had an effect, a transfer effect to the other side of the coin, or phonological awareness and overall reading. I'm transitioning now to another chapter that we just had accepted, where we focused, subsequent to this review of review, what other new studies might have come out in the last couple of years that wouldn't have been able to be eligible for these meta-analytic studies. And this is coming out in a handbook on science of early reading. So kind of the big picture before I show you a messy table with lots of small font. What we're extracting here today to try to explain is, where were there examples in school delivered implementation for RTI that had a successful hybrid of Tier 1 and Tier 2? And what did it take? And so in contrast to the Bailu study, where schools were kind of on their own. We're looking at anything from a hybrid of completely teacher given and a little bit of researcher support to completely provided by researchers, and also a hybrid of programs that were very standardized, but might have made a few data-based decisions about what group to put children into, what intervention they might benefit from, or they might have adjusted the pacing and the grouping size based on students' progress. So these studies shared in common having reliable screeners and valid progress monitoring data. They had consistent rules or routines for moving across tiers, or for eligibility at least for tiers. Emily, I don't think any of these studies gave us any concrete take-homes on exactly how long to wait. Teachers or the interventionists were provided a range of coaching for different aspects of the interventions. Tier 1 and Tier 2 were generally aligned in their materials and routines. And in some of these along the way, we'll also begin to see that some of those resilient factors were also being promoted. So as I promised, here's the messy slide. And I'm going to talk some big points about these different studies. So here is information about what the tiers were, whether it's 1 and 2 or just Tier 2. I have the author names and whether it's a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experimental study. So COIN followed that same regression discontinuity design that Bailu did. And these are the studies that I mentioned are kind of a hybrid, where they're not completely individualized, but they're definitely following some individualization. So within the kind of major themes that I'd like you guys to kind of take home, Dr. Foreman conducted a really large-scale study in Florida. She included students that were in grades K through 12. These were kids that were below the 30th percentile for vocabulary and reading. There were 2 different treatment conditions. In one condition, teachers, these were trained teachers that were hired by Foreman and colleagues, were trained to use curricular materials that made more explicit and systematic what was happening in Tier 1, so that these interventionists could kind of provide a jump start and a review of key content, versus a second set of interventions that were completely separate from the curriculum, a so-called standalone program. And both types of programs were equally effective, but what's really interesting is that when students started in either treatment and they were in the 10th percentile, the needle really moved. At the end of the year, they were up to the 20th percentile, and kindergarten students had the strongest growth. I'm going to jump down to the bottom study here by Hank Finn and colleagues. And this is a study that was at grade 1. This is an interesting study because Dr. Finn and his colleagues had 2 different RTI conditions. So in both conditions, the schools had to agree to use the same screeners, to use good progress monitoring measures, to use strong core instructional materials, to use intensive interventions, and to ensure that these were implemented with fidelity. So how the 2 different conditions differed was that in the enhanced core reading instruction condition, Hank and his colleagues actively provided professional development, coaching, not just for the interventions, but they also provided coaching around using database protocols to make decisions. And so in this study, we've got 2 different treatment conditions, but the enhanced core reading condition in kids in that condition outperformed students in schools that were doing the best of what they could do with RTI, with again fairly strong effects. So a G or a D is another way of expressing a metric for effect size. The next study I want to mention, and I'll highlight this in particular related to some of the questions that Tracy, that were given Tracy in terms of special ed. Matt Burns and his colleagues worked with a service corps organization in 6 schools in the Midwest. And they took children who were performing below the 10th percentile in oral reading fluency, but were not in special education, and compared their growth on oral reading fluency compared to students that had similarly impaired reading, but were in special ed. I won't talk about it today, but they also examine growth of typically developing children. And Matt and his colleagues were able to, on the basis of kids' initial scores, screen them into, I think it was 6 different decoding programs. They had fluency programs and comprehension programs. So it was a wide variety of programs. And what Dr. Burns and his colleagues found was that the effects for kids that were in Tier 2 that was implemented by this core favored the students that were in the special education condition on reading growth, and the effect sizes were fairly large. Now I'm going to jump up, so that's a little bit of a message about even if kids get into special education, we still need to be thinking about monitoring their progress and tailoring interventions for their needs. Dr. Coyne and his colleagues deliberately used, again, that same sort of regression discontinuity design. And again, they provided extensive coaching materials and really shored up RTI in a statewide initiative working in schools that were struggling. And they did show a positive effect for phonemic awareness and for decoding. So we're seeing a pattern of positive effects, certainly more than 0.20, and far outperforming what we saw in the Bailu study. Dr. Solari conducted another study, and in this study, she was training classroom teachers to provide Tier 2 in addition to Tier 1. And some of the teachers were assigned to a coached condition, and another was a less coached condition, and relative to business as usual. And what she found was that there were moderate effects for both treatment conditions on word reading and on comprehension for students whose teachers received some coaching. But there is a caveat. These teachers received relatively less support, and they were only able to provide about 66% of the intended dosage. And Dr. Solari and her colleagues also noted that for the students in their study that started first grade with the poorest word reading, they really remained poor readers at the end of the year. And so Dr. Solari and colleagues suggested that that might mean that some students might not need to wait. Maybe they need to go to the most immediate intervention at the start of first grade. The next messy big slide are some examples within, this is more Tier 2 to Tier 3, of what can work. And so Dr. Savage did an interesting study also at grade 1. Like Hank Finn, he had 2 very strong treatment conditions. So in one treatment, students were provided highly structured, explicit and systematic instruction. Children were able to read in decodable books. They had a variety of practice opportunities, but they also developed what they called direct mapping and set for variability for phonics. And what that meant is they trained their first graders not only on the phonetic rules, but they trained them to be flexible decoders, particularly if a vowel pattern that the students tried didn't work. And so these two conditions were very similar, but in the direct mapping and set for variability, there was this emphasis on flexible decoding, and the text that the children read also incorporated this type of practice. And they found a positive effect between the two conditions, favoring this variable instruction on oral reading fluency, and that on word reading, vocabulary, and spelling with fairly good effects. And they tested children again about a year later, and those effects declined somewhat, but some of them still maintained. So this is positive information that an effect can be maintained across time. Lynn Vernon Fagans has done quite a bit of work, and if any of you are working in rural schools, she's developed coaching called the Targeted Reading Intervention. So she and her team coach kindergarten and first grade teachers to work with a struggling reader within their classroom. And they randomly assign teachers to receiving that condition or being part of a wait list condition. And they found that there was a positive effect, again, above 0.20 on most of their measures, but we're seeing a pattern here of comprehension being a little bit more challenging to move. The final study that I just want to mention is kind of the flip side of the Burns study, where we saw that special educators or students in special education were not achieving the same growth trajectory as children in Tier 2. In this case, Dr. Weiser worked with special ed teachers. She provided them with coaching. Some was face-to-face, including on demand, and some was technology-based. There was also a business as usual condition. And interestingly, the effects for students were stronger when their teachers received ongoing coaching using technology in their classrooms. So I'm going to shift from the chapter on early RTI and talk about a study I conducted when I was living in Florida back in 2012, actually, so about a decade ago, where we had the opportunity in collaboration with the school district to randomly assign children who started with weak initial skills to start immediately in Tier 2 or Tier 3, or to go through an RTI process that we supported. And so we carefully trained the teachers, we documented that they were providing excellent Core 1 instruction. And so both of these models of response to instruction implementation just differed in terms of when the students were eligible for intensive intervention. We provided all of the interventions, and in collaboration with the school districts, because the district core was during Reading First was a fairly explicit core. We selected interventions that were related to the core, and to complement for Tier 3, we chose a program that was called Early Interventions in Reading that had similar instructional routines and signals. You can see the group sizes for these different interventions. And again, our team was conducting all of the intervention. We felt this was a good code-focused diet, but we felt the diet was a little bit lacking in terms of vocabulary and meaning instruction. So in the beginning, our kiddos, our scholars, had a hard time reading. So this was first grade. So in the first 8 weeks of instruction, that first segment, we provided a shared book reading approach where we read to the students to help build vocabulary. Then as they were able to read in decodable readers. We gave them lots of practice with some sentence comprehension instruction. And in the final 8 weeks of the study, we also supported the scholars in being aware of text sequencing structures within some of the decodable stories that we selected. And we also invited our scholars to do a scaffolded written response and retell. I'm going to go back because I'm realizing I forgot a really important study. No, it wasn't. Yeah, it was. I forgot to mention our friend Maureen Lovett's work. So Maureen, what made me think of it is Maureen also in her team, their interventionists are hired by their team, and they go out to schools and provide very strong intervention. And the reason I didn't want to overlook it is because they have the strongest effects within any of the studies we examined in those early years. So the grade levels were 1 through 3. They called it a tier 2 intervention. Students either received the treatment, which was Dr. Lovett and team's FAST plus RAVO. It's now you might commercially see FAST as being empower. So FAST incorporates, like Savage did, lots of different decoding strategies for letter sound instruction, to recognize keywords within and read them by analogy, to peel off prefixes and suffixes, to think flexibly about reading vowels, and then to looking at challenging multisyllabic words. And wow, this was really powerful. They had very strong effects on researcher-made measures, but also on standardized measures that were related to code-focused skills and to comprehension. Sorry for that, going backwards. So they were very, very effective. Within our RTI models, as I mentioned, in a typical RTI, students were screened. They began in tier 1, and after 8 weeks, if they were not successful, they were eligible for tier 2. And then another 8 weeks later, they could finally enter tier 3. By contrast, we screened students, and I'll share what our screening criteria were in just a minute, into being eligible for tier 2 or tier 3 immediately. And again, as I described in the answer to one of our viewers' questions, we followed the school's suggestion that 8 weeks would be practical for them. This was a fairly large study, and we had over half of the students were eligible for free and reduced price lunch. I do want to give an important caveat. At this point in time in Tallahassee, there were not many English language learners in our study, so I really wouldn't want anyone to feel like this necessarily would generalize to other schools that have different demographics. So these are our screeners. It took us less than 5 minutes. We administered the Ames-Webb letter sound fluency. The Fuchs, this is Lynn and Doug Fuchs' sight word fluency, so it's basically the Dolch words for first grade. And then Torgerson et al.'s test of word reading efficiency, the sight word and the phonemic decoding. We also considered teachers' nominations. So we considered how many different aspects of reading and writing teachers had expressed concern about for the students. And because we had one school that participated in our study that was as Tracy mentioned, kind of a bedroom community. This was actually a blue ribbon school in Florida, and we were considering school-based norms below the 40th percentile. We also said that children were not eligible for tier 3 if they performed above a 95th percentile on word reading and comprehension. So again, our eligibility for tier 3 right away was if they were below the school-based 40th percentile on all of those screening measures and their teacher had expressed concern. And for tier 2, we had an or. If they were at risk on at least 3 of the screeners or their teacher expressed concern, then they were in our safety net. So our effect sizes are much more modest than what some of the other studies have included, but this is a measure of the whole system. So I'm going to kind of walk you through this graphic for a moment. We are considering the end of the year outcome as sort of the zero on this statistical analysis. So these are months going backward. We work with these kids for about 8 months, and these are their W scores, their Roche-based scores on the Woodcock-Johnson brief reading. So the blue are children who are in Tier 1. The bold is kids that are in Tier 1 in the control condition. Remember, we randomly assign kids, so perhaps no surprise that there was no statistical differences. Those lines are almost lining up on top of each other, where we've got two groups of kids that are either assigned to the dynamic condition, but they never needed intervention, or they were assigned to typical RTI. They're still with their classroom teachers and never needed help. So this effect size is also very conservative, because it also takes into effect these non-significant differences. So there are significant differences in growth for the children who were in Tier 3, who got it right away, versus children who needed to wait to be eligible, and the same for Tier 2. But we were concerned about thinking about response. On the basic skills, we really knocked it out of the park. There were only about 5% of students within our schools that were scoring below the 25th percentile for basic reading. It was harder for us to move the needle on passage comprehension, and we also had a number of children that were still below the 25th percentile on timed measures. So we were thinking again about that, back to that model of resilience and risk, right? I'm bringing this model up now, and in our mind's eye, we were very curious about why some kids seem to do better in intervention. They seem to have more task-focused behavior. They had some adaptive coding strategies. So I'm just kind of showing you this slide again for our consideration. One of our doctoral students, Luana Grulich, really wanted to do a deep dive into this. So she examined all of the videos of our students who had performed below that 25th percentile, and watched the videos of how they performed during their Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions, and contrasted that with kids who were responsive. So she coded the responders and the non-responders in terms of their engagement and some academic emotions. And what she found, and I'm guessing that this is probably not a surprise, probably many of you have seen these sort of contrasting behaviors of a child that's kind of avoiding the intervention, especially when we're asking them in a small group to do something that's hard for them to do, versus kids that were highly engaged. She also was able to discern negative emotions from the inadequate responders that might make it more difficult for them to be resilient, and positive emotions from kids that were academic responders that might be a force for resilience. So those findings led us to think more about the efficacy of sending students with the greatest needs straight to intensive interventions, and the likelihood that there were always going to be a number of students that were going to need even more time, ongoing supports, and possibly some supports related to social and emotional learning components. This is a QR code, and I think Emily can also, or the team can put this in the chat. We just finished a chapter reviewing reading and mindset interventions for the Handbook of Special education. So again, back to our kind of constellation model, these social and emotional learning factors can be related to general academic success. And there have been a few studies recently that have looked at the associations, the relations between reading achievement and dimensions of reading mindset or perseverance, motivation, and attribution. But there's fairly limited experimental research showing us that it definitely works. So I'm going to be providing you with some information that doesn't completely converge. Okay? A couple of example studies. Orkin et al. Conducted a very intensive summer intervention that used both Ravo and Wilson. You'll be hearing a lot more about the effective Wilson program later. And they also incorporated, when they incorporated motivation, the post-treatment favored those kids and showed also increasing engagement and reduced avoidance behaviors. With one of my colleagues and I, Jeannie Wanzik, we did a cross-site, apologize for the little typo down here, cross-site study in Texas and in Tennessee, where we used the Lindemood program and assigned kids to a business as usual or receiving just Lindemood or getting Lindemood with or without the growth mindset commercially available program called Brainology. And we found that children in both conditions who were at risk for reading problems showed stronger effects on non-word reading, phonological reading, and comprehension, small effects, but we didn't find differences on growth mindset. I mentioned Jess Tost at the UT Austin. She and her colleagues have been working a lot in this challenging time frame of teaching multisyllabic words and helping kids become more aware of morphology. And she has developed some multisyllabic word reading strategies that are not dissimilar from some of the work that Dr. Lovett and others have been doing. But she tested whether it would be more effective if they also did attribution retraining, meaning, hey, I'm attributing what I'm getting better at to what I'm doing, and also some goal setting. So the kids were sometimes actually graphing their own data, working in small groups, they're upper elementary, and she found that with or without that attribution training, kids had stronger outcomes when they received the multisyllabic instruction, either type of training relative to business as usual on decoding, spelling, and comprehension. But again, no differences in self-concept. And Lovett and colleagues have also done some work in middle school and high school using that same FAST program that I mentioned earlier, kind of an extension for older students. They also incorporated either comprehension or fluency training and included a lot of those multisyllabic kinds of word strategies. And the effects were, again, strong, not as strong as they were for those younger students in terms of word reading, but see, they are getting an impact, a boost for sense of reading competence. So got some mixed findings there. Thanks for listening. That was a lot. I think I'm gonna plow through, Emily, and talk briefly about our a project that we're doing right now to design an embedded mindset or social and emotional learning thematic unit within a shared book reading evidence-based program for kindergarten. So we're designing, and we've been field testing with our team implementing at the start of this coming back from COVID period, rather than asking the teachers to do their full-on field trial. They've been observing what we're doing and giving us feedback. So we've chosen books with multicultural characters to represent the children's lived experiences. We've included explicit vocabulary instruction. We've had feedback from folks in the behavior field, folks in speech language kinds of backgrounds, and we've created very explicit lesson plans designed for brief periods of time. So within dialogic reading, there's an aspect of building children's ability to discuss or dialogue about the book by asking more and more challenging questions. So in the beginning, the teacher asks questions that relate specifically to information in the book and to text and pictures, and then expanding to including questions that are outside of the book. They're a little bit of it at a distance, that might include questions about how these concepts and vocabulary words might be used at home, if we're working on the word sad or happy, or in schools. So this is sort of a little prompt card for the teachers for the different types of questions that get increasingly more difficult. So we've come up with 5 different thematic units. The first, which is kind of easiest, is I can name my feelings, and that's an example of one of the books. I can learn from my mistakes, and David's sitting over here in the timeout corner learning from some of his mistakes. I can persist. We've got a couple of books with the character Jabari. In this one, it's Jabari trying. I can be kind to others and myself. An example of that is listening with my heart. And then the most complex and kind of abstract unit that we have is working towards and achieving goals. And so the most magnificent thing is an example, and this is the wonderful thing that she's building. So you can imagine that the vocabulary is accumulating across these different units. We provide teachers with a week at a glance that tells them what vocabulary they're going to focus on and gives them examples of questions. We've designed vocabulary cards, and with a little help from some research funds, we've also been able to translate these into Spanish, and we're going to do a field trial in a dual language classroom within the next month. I'm going to share a kind of a quick walk through some resources. Tracy mentioned the need for structured literacy intervention, so I just wanted to give a shout out to Louise Swirling. And again, I do have a chapter in this book, so I'm a little self-serving, but it's a book that's describing different types of structured literacy interventions for schools that might be helpful for book study. So again, I'm imagining that you and our audience can make a difference, and that some of the roles in which you might make a difference might be supporting parents, planning to observe a colleague, or help be part of a selection committee for a Core 1 program. You might be looking at adopting other interventions. Maybe you'll have a chance to lead a professional learning community team or have a book study, whether it's within your social media or your school family home. Maybe you'll be sharing resources and making requests from your school about supports that might be needed at the school level, or maybe you just need some more ideas for how to have meaningful professional development like today and collecting credits. So in terms of helping parents, there's a couple of small scale studies that are showing we can also involve our parents and helping their children have more of a growth mindset. And here, this was kind of interesting. It was parents were instructed by phone just to provide a little bit of support and encouragement. And the encouragement was not just working on decoding, right? And they kept track, and the students with highly engaged parents showed greater outcomes. Again, not causal, it's a small scale study. A little bit of a larger one provided parents with a little bit more support. So there's some promise. If you're interested in Tier 1, Project Iris is a program that happens at Vanderbilt right near MTSU, and these are free supports, but this is actually helping you understand a little bit more about what a high quality Tier 1 might be. Vanderbilt also offers CEUs, and these are asynchronous training modules through IRIS. If you're thinking, oh my goodness, our school is really upside down in RTI, you might be looking for some class-wide kinds of programs. So an example might be peer-assisted learning strategies. One of the studies, this is had a lot of research behind it. It was developed by Deb Simmons, Patricia Mathis, and Lynn and Doug Fuchs at Vanderbilt. And in one small-scale study, in grade 3, within just 10 weeks, students who were assigned to participating and practicing with their buddies within their classroom were able to achieve a marked improvement in oral reading fluency versus kids in another classroom that just went on in their typical practice. So this slide shows information from the What Works Clearinghouse from the Institute of Education Science that helps you decide whether a strategy like PALS might be helpful in your school. So in this case, is it likely to be helpful when students have a learning disability, or is it likely to be helpful for English language learners? So the IES What Works Clearinghouse gives us some specific information by reviewing a large number of studies and telling us where the evidence is high. So thinking about within your school, if you're looking to support Tier 1, you might think about a class-wide program. Or if you have volunteers and paraprofessionals that can help, Sound Partners is a well-researched intervention. If you have more resources and more specialized help, then you might look at some of these other programs that I've mentioned today. When you're working with teachers and they say to you, oh my gosh, how do I do one more thing in my classroom? How can I make small group intervention work? You might want to share that children can actually actively learn during center time that can allow teachers to have extra time or to provide a double dose for students, whether they need more support in that code-focused side or in the meaning-focused side. I'll point out resources that come from the Florida Center for Reading Research that are in the domain, and a resource that could be helpful for professional learning communities that really supports a process or a protocol for database decision making. This is stemmed in school psychology research. Another example beyond the structured literacy book is a book that I've co-authored with colleagues, and we have chapters on how to intensify interventions for various components. And we also talk a little bit about how to make things more explicit, and we have specific case studies that you can work through with your students. I've bolded this transfer to new contexts to provide some examples. My colleague Jill Allure and I have developed a curriculum. Initially, we developed it for kids with some cognitive delays, and we've been testing it now on a broader array of students. Jill's come to MTSU and done a couple of trainings. So here's an example of transfer. So if we're teaching kids how to read words in a list, we want to be sure, like Savage and Lovett have done, that we're giving kids a chance to read words in connected text. Some of our students might need 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times to recognize even a decodable word as if by sight, right? They're still sounding words out. So having extra games or practice opportunities can be helpful. We also want to transfer to different types of genres and content area text, and from reading to writing. So if you're interested in learning more about Friends on the Block, I think Jill has got quite a few sample items for you there. The final resources are clickable here. You'll be able to click to learn more about Project Iris or the intensive practice guides that I've mentioned. I've also thrown in some links here to supports from the International Dyslexia Association and Reading Rockets, and some helpful supports for you from IES that are the practice guides to support you in improving your practice and being able to have discussions around the kind of assessment that Tim was talking about. What is formative assessment rather than painful assessment?